distinguished partners of the Global Peace Foundation, honorable National Assembly members, all the sponsoring organizations and agencies that are participating in this conference. Congratulations for this noble effort. Let's give everyone a round of applause. As the previous speakers have suggested, we live in precarious times. I believe that, especially here in Korea, South Korea, many of us are numb to the fact that we have been dealing with the threat of potential conflict on the peninsula ever since the armistice in 1953. So it's very easy for us to once again fall back into the old frameworks of thinking that we have been enduring and living through for the last 70 years. But one of the things that we need to be aware of today is that the entire calculus has changed. As a student of history, especially in my senior year at Columbia University, I wrote and did research of my honors research paper on the interwar years between 1945 to 1950 and the outbreak of the Korean War. And of course, because my family had been steeped in not only Korea's fight for liberation under the colonial yoke of Japan, but also thereafter to try to bring peace on the peninsula. This had been an interest of mine ever since I was a young boy. And as a student, I earnestly sought to understand what was the fundamental issues that were arising after Korea achieved liberation from Japan. Because although Korea is an ancient civilization that goes back 5,000 years, for the last 70 years, the division of the Korean peninsula has been a reality that Koreans on both sides of the border, north and south, have been living with. And yet, even when Koreans speak of the issues today, they speak within that framework, within the narrative of that division. What happened after 1945 is a tragedy when you look at Korean history from its beginning to that point in human history. The separation of the Korean people was not the desire or the wish of the Korean people, but it was a foreign construct imposed on the Korean people at a time when they were hopeful that finally a nation that was subjugated, that was stripped of its identity, a people that had their dreams shattered and hopes shattered, could finally realize the dream that had animated these people for 5,000 years. Division of the Korean people represents that tragedy. And yet today, even South Koreans look upon that division as if it is a reality that they have to accept. When I started this unification movement in 2010, the first key issue that we had to address was to build a vision that allows the Korean people and all sincere, well-intentioned individuals, nations, and parties that want to resolve the problem on the Korean Peninsula to recognize first and foremost that the ideological construct of the Cold War was no longer relevant for not only the Korean people, but for this age. What was needed was a vision to unite the Korean people north and south that was not tainted by any foreign construct, but was uniquely Korean and had defined the identity of the Korean people. The book I authored in 2014 under the Korean Dream, title of the Korean Dream, was an effort to build that vision. Now remember, up until that time, there was no Korean Dream. In that book, in dealing with the issue of unification, I touched upon the history of the Korean people. Most importantly, the founding mythology upon which the Korean people's identity and national sense of destiny was formed. 통일인간, which is known to all Koreans, and it articulated this national destiny and vision upon which I wrote that book. That book was a vision of a unified peninsula, of a unified people that has the shared destiny to serve all humanity and set a model nation for all nations to follow. We heard speakers from the international community. They've pointed out very clearly that today we live in precarious times. Right now, the United States and North Korea are on a course of conflict. The historic trip of the American president to Asia, and especially to South Korea, he articulated the American agenda of his administration. That the United States will not allow the North Korea to be a nuclear threat to the United States or any of its allies. What that means, we have yet to see. Of course, Kim Jong-un's administration, as well as his fathers and his grandfathers, had been looking towards the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology. Yet, the commitment for nuclear weapons and the ability to attack the United States has sped up in exponential rates under the Kim Jong-un administration. They are steadfast in their commitment to develop a nuclear North Korea. Under this scenario, there's only two options. Either through some type of diplomacy, North Korea stops its nuclear program, or there's conflict. So the issues that Dr. Nalapad raises are very real. Yet, being a person who believes in God and in destiny and in providence, and especially somebody who believes and has faith in the Korean people, in the destiny of the Korean people, I believe that there's an alternative option and that this crisis can turn into an opportunity that can finally end the cruel chapter of the divided Koreas that had been imposed upon the Korean people. That this can be a time where Koreans can be in charge of their own destiny to help to architect and define their own future, a future that is not divided, but is united as one, that realizes their providential charge, the vision of Hongin-gan, to be the benefit to all humanity. You know, as a student of history, there are moments in time that can define an age. I believe we live in such a time. For the first time in the geopolitics of this region, the most influential nations of this region and the world are recognizing the importance of the peninsular issue. As a Korean who lives in America, for the first time in my memory, and as a student of American history and American foreign policy, for the first time in American foreign policy, there is a fundamental shift. Korea is no longer an afterthought of American foreign policy, but Korea is the most important priority in American foreign policy. So instead of talking about opinion, let's talk about facts of what's happening geopolitically in this region today. For the first time in this region's history, the United States had China agree to financial banking sanctions of North Korea. Never was there this level of cooperation between the two most important powers within this region, the United States and China. I believe these banking and financial sanctions will have huge, huge implications for North Korea. I think we need to start off by realizing that North Korea is a rogue state, and they have been engaged in all the activities that all the civilized nations of the world frown upon and have basically reprimanded North Korea on. And that will not change. The increase of the black market in North Korea as a negative, I look at it as a positive. Very much like what happened in the Soviet Union, where the free world sanctions on the Soviet bloc led to the rise of black markets that then led to the inflow of information to the general people of the Soviet Union that made them understand that their system was not as good as the systems in the West. Today, we have multimedia technology that did not exist 10 to 20 years ago. Today, all you need is a cell phone, and you have access to the rest of the world. What will happen with the rise or the increase of the black market in North Korea? Every dictatorial regime, the thing that they fear of the most is not having control over their population. You're going to see the erosion of the Kim regime, not from outside pressures, but from within. This is the opportunity for South Korea. The world is now watching the peninsular issue. Everybody is wondering how to move forward from now on. Even America's commitment to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, they still haven't developed their policy yet.
물론
Everything is in the air. And this
미국조차도
is where the opportunity is.
그렇기
And that is
때문에
why
여기 기회가 있는 거죠.
vision is so important. How do we build consensus, not only here in South Korea, but in the international community, to find a solution to this global crisis? As a person of faith and as someone whose family was committed to the unification of the Korean Peninsula, I think there's only one option. Outside of the two options that currently the North Korean regime and the United States is now headed down towards. There's a third way, and that is the peaceful unification. If we understand that as an end goal, then we deal with the denuclearization issue, but more importantly, we close the chapter of the divided Koreas and open up a new chapter of a united Korean people fulfilling their national destiny in line with the Hongik-ingan ideal to serve all humanity. I think it's very important. And this is where really the onus lies upon South Korea. The problem with South Korea right now is they're all divided. And there are many assumptions that many South Koreans have that fall within that Cold War framework. That does not put into account the current geopolitical crisis that they are currently under. They have been numbed to the realities of division. That is why conferences such as this and initiatives such as AKU is so significant in the history of our people. Because it brings the vision and the clarity of the way forward in this time of global crisis. My hope is that the Moon Jae-in administration recognizes this historic opportunity that they have been afforded by fate and sets as the national agenda of South Korea the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. So as the nations within this geopolitical environment start to formulate their policy in terms of how to deal with the Korean nuclear issue, that becomes the alternative, the only sound and reasonable alternative that can deal with the nuclear issue, but more importantly, bring an end to the tragedy that was imposed upon the Korean people throughout the 20th century. The tragedy of colonialism and the tragedy of a divided peninsula due to the ideological divide between communism and the free world. I want to remind Koreans that in 1948 there was to be a national election for a united Korean government. Yet, those elections never took place. And the two governments of North and South Korea were formed in its place that reflected the ideological divide of the Cold War. If we look at the current existing two nations as within the context of Korean history, this is but just a transitory process. All Koreans, North and South, should recognize that the existence of these two governments was meant to eventually lead to a unified Korea. That these two governments represents a transitory process for the creation of a one unified Korean nation. One thing I want to remind my good friend Dr. Nalapat is this. I think it would be a grave mistake for the international community if it recognizes the national identity of North Korea. The position of the free world was that South Korea represented the Korean people. And it has always been the intention of the grandfather's regime, the father's regime, and now the son's regime to get that legitimacy of recognition from the international community. That should never happen. These two governments represent a transitory moment in the history and the story of the Korean people. What should be the end of that story should be the formation of a new nation that all Koreans, both North and South, can call their home. That upholds the fundamental ideals and values that the Korean people were founded upon, etched in the Hongik-ingan. That is why I believe it should be the national policy of South Korea to lead in that effort and to make that the agenda, regardless of which party, left or right, is in power. This should be the stated mission and goal of South Korea. You know, we stand, once again, like I said, in an inflection point in history. Next year, we're going to be hosting, South Korea is going to be hosting the Pyeongchang Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games here in Korea. It reminds me of 30 years ago, when I, as a young man representing the Republic of Korea, participated in the Seoul Olympic Games as one of its athletes. 1988 was a historic year in the history of South Korea because it also marked the first transition to a democratic process. But more importantly, South Korea became the central point in which the world community, both the Soviet bloc and the free world, came together for the first time after the ban of the LA Games by the Soviet bloc and the ban of the Moscow Games by the United States and the free world. Next year, the Olympics will be coming back to South Korea. In this hotly defined issue of the nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Once again, global attention is once again on the peninsula. This is a historic moment. This is a historic moment. Then in 2019, we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union, or the historic representation of the end of the Soviet Union, which is the breaking down of the Berlin Wall, the wall that divided East and West. But more importantly for Koreans, it marks the 100th year centennial of the March 1st, 1919 movement for independence, from which the founders of both South and North Korea came from and were part of. So remember what I told you when I wrote my book, The Korean Dream, in 2014. I looked to history, to vision, to unite the two Koreas and bring them out of the Cold War framework that was imposed upon us. Better way to once again remind the Koreans of both Koreas the hopes, the dreams, and the aspirations of the independent fighters that were seeking to develop a model ideal nation along the ideas of Hongik-ingan. One of the reasons why this can become a global phenomenon is because the March 1st, 1919 movement for independence inspired the nationalist movements for independence around the world, especially the young Mahatma Gandhi, that later adopted the practices of the March 1st movement of nonviolent protest to lead to the national independence of the Indian people from British colonial rule. The Korean people laid a seed in the 20th century that should blossom in the 21st century and lead the world to peace by solving the most important geopolitical issue in the world today, which is the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. What better way to galvanize global opinion, and what better way for us as Koreans to reignite our sense of our Korean identity and our sense of our Korean destiny. So I want to invite all of you to participate in the 1K Global Campaign, tied to the centennial celebration of the independence movement that inspired and built the hopes of the Korean people and the development of a new Korean nation that can be inspiration to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.